The snow had come early that year, quiet, powder-fine, and relentless. It sifted through the lodgepole pines like spilled flour, settling over the hides, rifles, and worn moccasins of the 5 men moving silently through the timber. Their breath rose in faint clouds, ghosts above the earth. These were not soldiers, nor the kind of trappers who lived by the sound of their own boasting. They were scouts, Crow and Shoshone men, hardened by mountain winters, guided not by compass or map, but by memory. The leader, a Crow called Red Elk, paused at the edge of a frozen creek and knelt. He brushed snow away with the back of his mittened hand, revealing a faint print. Elk-hide sole, trimmed short at the heel. He studied it for a heartbeat, then looked to the man behind him, a tall, bearded trapper in a buckskin coat patched with sinew. "Smith's men," Red Elk said quietly. His English was slow, deliberate. "They passed here not 2 suns ago." The trapper nodded. Jedediah Strong. Smith, the man whose journal entries would one day define the edge of the known West, was somewhere ahead, moving toward the high country. What Smith sought was trade. What the Crow Scouts sought was survival. But beneath that partnership ran a deeper current, something unseen by the government men who sent expeditions west, or by the fur company clerks who tallied pelts back in St. Louis. It was the art of disappearance, of making a home invisible in a land that punished the careless. The Wind River country was a world at war with exposure. Frost could strip flesh from bone faster than any enemy. The Blackfeet, the Sioux, and even rival trappers prowled the same passes, and to be seen was often to be dead. In this crucible, a new kind of structure was born, the hidden fort, the mountain's secret refuge. It was not a fort in the soldier's sense, no palisades, no flags, no roaring cannon. The first explorers to hear of them dismissed the stories as superstition, but among the Crow, the Shoshone, and the mixed-blood scouts who walked between nations, these hidden strongholds were legend. Lodges carved into the earth, camouflaged by brush and shadow, where a man could vanish from pursuit and watch the enemy pass a few paces away. One such fort lay just beyond Horse Creek, a tributary of the Green River. Local memory held that Smith himself had once sought shelter there after losing his horses to a blizzard. His journal, recovered after his death in 1831, mentions a fort of curious design, built without axe or nail, yet stronger than the hand of Providence could tear down. Smith Journal, 1831-32. Historians have debated whether Smith was describing a natural cave or a man-made refuge, but those who lived the life knew better. To the mountain men, survival demanded invention. A hidden fort could not be built with the noise of axes or the smoke of fresh-cut pine. Instead, it grew from the land itself. A fallen tree became a ridgepole, wind-thrown, branches became walls. Frozen mud and pine pitch sealed the cracks. Moss hid the seams. From 50 yards, it looked like nothing more than a thicket of windfall. From 10 yards, even less. As Red Elk's party moved deeper into the valley, they found what they were searching for. A half-frozen pond sat still beneath the ridge, its surface glinting gray beneath the clouds. Beyond it rose a mound of snow-dusted brush. Red Elk brushed aside the branches, revealing a narrow opening. The bearded trapper ducked inside. For a moment, the forest swallowed him whole. Then his voice echoed softly from within. "By God, she's still here." Inside, the hidden fort was no larger than a single-room cabin, 8 feet by 10, low-ceilinged and dry. The walls were woven with willow, sealed with clay, the air heavy with the scent of old smoke. A stone hearth crouched in one corner, its vent disguised by a hollow log that carried smoke 20 feet away before releasing it into the wind. The floor was hard-packed dirt, covered with a thin layer of pine needles. On one wall, carved into the clay, was a rough emblem, a cross within a circle, a mark often used by the Crow Scouts to signify safe refuge. This place, Red Elk said, was built in the old way, before the whites brought their saws. Men hid here when the Blackfeet hunted the river. The mountain frontier of the 1,820 was a crossroads of desperation and genius. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the Hudson's Bay, and countless free trappers competed for the same beaver streams. Camps came and went with the thaw, leaving behind little but ashes and broken traps. But the hidden forts endured. They were not built for trade, they were built for continuity. Men like Beckworth and Bridger later told tales of such places. Lodges so cleverly concealed that travelers could ride over them unaware. Beckworth, 1856. In 1835, Charles Larpenteur wrote from the upper Missouri, noting, "There were certain shelters in the hills which no man could find again, save he who built them." Larpenteur, Journal 1835. These were not myths. They were the mountain's reply to civilization's hunger. Outside, the snow thickened. The scouts gathered within the fort, their breath mixing with the faint warmth of a rekindled ember. The trapper drew his blanket tighter and took out a small, leather-bound notebook. "Smith wrote of these," he said quietly. Said the Crow could build a fortress out of wind and shadow. Red Elk smiled faintly. "The mountain hides what it loves. Only fools try to stand taller than the trees." It was more than poetry. The native builders understood camouflage not as a tactic, but as a form of respect. The land would protect those who moved like it slowly, quietly, without waste. A fort was not a place to dominate the wilderness, but to listen to it breathe. As dusk fell, the men sealed the entrance behind them. Outside, the wind rose in long, mournful sighs, sweeping over the ridge. From a distance, the fort disappeared entirely, an illusion perfected by centuries of necessity. By morning, their tracks would vanish beneath new snow. The fort would remain a ghost of bark and clay, waiting for another generation of wanderers to stumble upon it and marvel at its simplicity. The river was running high, swollen by the melt. Its roar carried for miles through the cottonwoods. A dozen horses stood tethered near the willows, their flanks still damp from the crossing. Around the small campfire, two men worked in silence, one white, one dark, both marked by the mountain in the same way. By scars, by hunger, and by a certain patience that only solitude teaches. The white man was James Pearson Beckworth, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard gone gray at the edges. His rifle lay across his knees, and his eyes followed every movement of the Crow scout who crouched opposite him, twisting fresh sinew around a fletched arrow. They had trapped together all winter. In Beckworth's words, "We lived as brothers, bound by the snows and the wolves alike." Beckworth, Adventures, 1856. But the man he called brother, Black Moccasin, had given him more than companionship. He had given him a new way to see the land, not as a map to conquer, but as a living thing to move through unseen. That morning they were building another fort. Not the grand kind men drew on maps, no bastions, no parapets, but a place where fire could burn and no smoke betray it, where traders could sleep while war parties passed within earshot. "White men build walls," Black Moccasin said, testing the bow's pull. "Crow build shadows." Beckworth grinned. "Shadows won't stop a bullet." The Crow looked up, expression unreadable. "Then the bullet must find you first." He rose and led the way through the undergrowth to a hollowed slope above the riverbank. There, the forest thickened around a fallen pine, its trunk rotted through, roots twisted, like a giant's ribs. With practiced hands, the two men began to work. No axes, no hammer blows, only the sound of brush shifting, wood cracking, and earth being moved. They set a framework of willow saplings between the exposed roots, weaving them together with rawhide. Over this, they laid bark, moss, and earth. Inside, they dug shallow sleeping pits lined with buffalo hide. A smoke trench ran from the hearth to a gap in the root mass, where it dispersed into the soil. By dusk, it was done. From the riverbank, the fort looked like nothing but a tangle of storm-felled timber. From within, it was a shelter against rain, wind, and fear. "See how the mountain hides us," Black Moccasin said, kneeling by the fire pit. "This is how the old ones lived, before war and trade. We built with the hand of the earth, not against it." Beckworth would later write of this moment with his characteristic flourish. The Crow taught me that strength lies not in the high walls a man builds, but in how quietly he can vanish when the foe comes upon him. Beckworth, 1856. That lesson would save his life more than once. The upper Yellowstone was then a territory of shifting alliances and uneasy truces. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the Hudson's Bay men, and bands of independent trappers all drifted through the same valleys, setting traps in waters claimed by the Blackfeet, the Flathead, and the Crow. Violence was constant, though seldom recorded in any official ledger. Every man on the frontier carried his own law and his own grave in his pack. Beckworth, son of a white Virginia planter and an enslaved woman, had long been an outsider in both worlds. The Crow adopted him, naming him Bull's Robe. To them, he was not half of anything, he was a whole man, bound to their people by deed and endurance. He learned their ways of war, their ceremonies, and their craft of concealment. One winter, while hunting on the Bighorn, his band was cornered by a Blackfeet war party. Outnumbered 5-1, they retreated into the foothills, using gullies and snowdrifts to vanish. Beckworth recalled how they came upon an abandoned earth lodge fort, so cleverly disguised beneath the drifts that it seemed part of the mountain itself. "We crouched within that womb of the earth," he wrote, "and the enemy passed within yards of our hiding, seeing naught but wind and stone. I knew then the genius of my adopted kin." Beckworth, 1856. The hidden forts of the Crow and Shoshone were not monuments. They were born of impermanence designed to vanish with the season. Each fort was an act of humility, a recognition that no man ruled the mountains for long. Beckworth's fort with black moccasins stood for barely a month before spring floods swept it away. When they returned weeks later, nothing remained but the impression of the walls in the mud. Yet the knowledge endured. Every man who passed through Beckworth's camps learned a little of that quiet magic, how to make a refuge where no map could find it. That same year, word spread along the fur routes of Jedediah Smith's disappearance in the Southwest. Rumors said he had been killed by Comanche. Others whispered that he'd gone native, living among tribes unknown. The mountains were good at keeping secrets. Beckworth, hearing of it, said simply, "Smith learned the hard way what the Crow already knew, that a man who cannot vanish will not live long here." These were the years when the mountain men became legends. Bridger, Fitzpatrick, Sublette, their names echoing through rendezvous camps like hymns. Yet behind their exploits lay the invisible labor of native scouts and builders whose knowledge made those journeys possible. Without them, the trappers would have perished by the hundred. Historians like Dale L. Morgan Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West, 1953, later noted that nearly every major expedition relied on indigenous ingenuity. Each crossing, each winter camp, owed its success not to European science, but to the quiet adaptation of tribal methods. The hidden forts were the purest example of this collaboration, where two worlds met not through conquest, but through shared necessity. By midsummer, Beckworth had risen among the Crow to the rank of war chief. He carried their lance, wore their robes, and led their scouts along the Yellowstone. Yet he never forgot the lesson of that spring on the river. To survive, one must disappear. He wrote in his later years, "Among the white trappers, a fort is built to be seen to show the strength of men. Among the Crow, a fort is built to be forgotten, that the land may keep it safe. And when the builder dies, the mountain closes over him as if he never was." Beckworth, 1856. One evening, under the fading light of June, Beckworth and Black Moccasin stood upon a ridge overlooking the basin. The air smelled of sage and thawing soil. Below them, smoke from some distant camp curled faintly against the horizon. "Another fort?" Beckworth asked. The Crow scout smiled. "No, that one belongs to the white traders. Their forts shout to the wind, ours whisper." He gestured to the hills around them, endless and unbroken. The wind remembers the whisper longer. The two men stood in silence. To the east, the sun fell behind the Absaroka Range, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Somewhere down there, The hidden forts of the Crow lay sleeping beneath grass and stone, unmarked, unseen, and eternal. And though time would wash away their walls, their idea endured, that the truest strength on the frontier was not the might to build higher, but the wisdom to be unseen. The sky had already gone iron gray by mid-afternoon. Wind came down the mountains in long, hollow breaths, stirring the sagebrush and sweeping old snow into the hollows. Down in the willows where Horse Creek met the Green River, 3 men and 2 Crow scouts worked silently, their movements deliberate, as if the forest itself were listening. They were not building a cabin, they were erasing one. The logs had been dragged by mule at night, stripped of bark, and rubbed with wet earth until they matched the color of the deadwood around them. Every cut was hidden beneath moss, every sound muffled by distance. The scouts worked with a kind of reverence, bending branches, weaving reeds, whispering to one another in Crow. The trappers, hardened men of the mountains, followed their lead without question. The fort they were building would never be marked on a map. Yet among the mountain men it would become a legend. The hidden fort at Horse Creek, a shelter so well concealed that an entire Blackfeet warband once rode over it without knowing it was there. The man overseeing the work was Thomas Fitzpatrick, Irish by birth, trapper by fate. The men called him Broken Hand for the wound he carried from an earlier fight near the Platte. He was one of William Sublette's scouts, a partner of Smith and Bridger, and perhaps the most cautious of them all. Fitzpatrick had spent too many winters in the Rockies to believe in luck. When word reached him that a Blackfeet hunting party had crossed the Wind River, he knew what must be done. The rendezvous season was over, the Green River Valley emptying of traders. If the Blackfeet found his winter camp, his men would not live to see spring. So he turned to the Crow scouts who traveled with him, Lone Elk and Two Feathers, and asked them to teach him how the mountains hide their own. They led him here, to a bend in Horse Creek that curved like a cradle beneath a sandstone bluff. Water ran slow and black under the ice. The valley was narrow, walled in by firs. To the untrained eye, it was an ordinary glade. To the Crow, it was a fortress waiting to be born. They began by choosing the ground, a shallow depression in the slope, shielded from view by a tangle of chokecherry and fallen pine. The soil was dry and firm, good for digging. The Crow worked with antler picks and wooden spades, carving out a space barely large enough for 5 men to sleep side by side. Fitzpatrick ordered the trappers to haul in driftwood and pine boughs while the scouts shaped the walls. It took 4 days. On the 5th, they lined the pit with logs, stacking them in a circle so tight that daylight could not pass through. Over the top, they laid crossbeams of willow and sapling, then heaped sod, mud, and brush until the roof became indistinguishable from the hillside. Smoke from the hearth was piped through a reed vent buried under a tangle of roots 20 paces away. When Fitzpatrick finally stood back, the entrance was the size of a foxhole hidden behind a deadfall. From 30 feet, the fort vanished completely. "This place," Lone Elk said, crouching to test the door flap, "will breathe but not speak. The wind will not tell on you." Fitzpatrick nodded. He knew enough to understand what a gift that was. Inside, the fort was barely 8 feet across and 6 high. The air was warm, though the world outside had already frozen. They covered the floor with buffalo hide, stocked meat and powder in clay-sealed pits, and hung their rifles from the beams. Two Feathers painted a small crow feather above the hearth, a mark of protection. When the first snow came, they sealed themselves in. For 6 weeks, no sound left the fort. They hunted at night, moving through the timber like ghosts. By day, they sat in the dark, listening to the wind. Then, in December, the danger came. It was near dawn when Lone Elk, keeping watch through a peephole cut in the roof, saw movement in the valley. Riders, many of them moving single file through the willows. Blackfeet. Their ponies steamed in the cold. The scouts counted 20, maybe more. They carried lances tipped with metal and muskets taken from traders. The trappers froze. Fitzpatrick motioned for silence. The only sound was the low crackle of a hidden ember. The war party rode closer. 10 paces. 5. The horses' hooves broke the crust of snow directly above the roof. Fitzpatrick could see the faint shadow of their legs through the chinks in the beams. He held his breath. One of the warriors dismounted, walked to a tree, and scraped his knife against the bark. He looked around, sniffed the air. The fort's smoke pipe lay just yards from where he stood, buried under the roots of a fallen fir. For a moment it seemed he had caught some scent of human presence. He raised his head. Then the wind shifted. It blew the scent away, and the warrior turned back to his horse. The column moved on, disappearing into the trees. Inside the fort, no one moved for nearly an hour. Finally, Lone Elk exhaled. "They rode upon our roof," he whispered, "and the mountain hid us." That winter became part of frontier lore. Fitzpatrick, when he rejoined his partners at the 1,830 rendezvous on the Green, told the story to Bridger and Sublette. "We slept beneath their horses," he said, "and the earth itself kept us alive." Word spread quickly among the trappers. They began to speak of the Crow Fort at Horse Creek, part legend, part blueprint. Men tried to copy its design, but none matched the original. The genius of it lay not in the materials but in the philosophy, the understanding that the strongest walls are those the eye cannot see. Historians later found partial corroboration in Give Your Heart to the Hawks. Win Blevins, 1973. Blevins notes a recorded oral tradition among the Crow of a winter house built with the hands of both white and red men, into which the storm and the enemy could not enter. The location matches the Green River Valley, near Horse Creek. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal in the early 2000s describe similar semi-subterranean lodges camouflaged with sod structures that could easily have served as hidden forts. By early spring, when the thaw came, the Horse Creek Fort collapsed under its own roof. Fitzpatrick's men dug themselves free and watched as the sod and mud sank back into the hillside. Within a week, nothing remained but a shallow depression and a scatter of ashes. Yet even in ruin, the fort fulfilled its purpose. It had been invisible when it mattered. Lone Elk and Two Feathers returned to the Crow country that summer, and Fitzpatrick, forever changed by what he had witnessed, carried the lesson with him through every winter that followed. In his later years, when asked by younger trappers how he had survived so long, he would answer simply, "By letting the mountain keep my secret," the snowmelt whispered down the slopes like 1,000 secret tongues. In the high basins of the Bighorn country, spring came not as a burst of color, but as a slow loosening of the land ice sighing, pine needles shedding frost, the rivers thick with the gray breath of thaw. It was here that the hidden forts lived their longest lives, breathing in rhythm with the mountains themselves. Crow scouts called them Ashpe Awachi, the forts that whisper. They were not forts in the white man's sense. No palisades, no squared corners, no cannon bristling from blockhouses. They were places of refuge and memory, built in stone and silence. The mountain men who had helped raise them, Smith's men, Bridgers, Carsons, nameless trappers who followed the beaver trails, had long since moved on. Yet the shelters endured, guarded by the same secrecy that had birthed them. In the spring of 1832, one such fort still held life. At first light, a thin smoke lifted from a ledge beneath a limestone bluff. The fort was invisible from the valley floor. Even a hawk gliding overhead might have missed it. Inside, 2 Crow scouts sat by the coals, speaking in low voices. One was gray-haired and stooped, a veteran of the old alliances. The other was young, no more than 20 winters, his hair bound with an otter fur strip and his bow resting across his knees. The elder, known among the traders as Old Bear in the Brush, was telling the boy a story that few white men had ever heard, the making of the first hidden fort. "It was the year the beavers ran thick," he said, stirring the ashes with a willow twig. "We built it with Smith's men. They were lean and half-starved and too proud to turn back. So we taught them the old way, the way of stone and grass. You see, a fort should be part of the hill. If you can see it, it will die." The boy listened, wide-eyed. He had never seen a white man, Though he knew of them, the iron traps, the trade knives, the bright cloth and fire sticks that came from the south and east, the old scout's voice rolled on like the murmur of the thawing creek. We built the walls low, using rock shaped by the wind. No straight lines are for fools who want to be found. We bent them like the ridge of a deer's back. We covered the roof with bark and sod, tied with willow roots. When it rained, the fort vanished. When it snowed, it slept. Down in the basin below, a new kind of traveler was moving a party of fur men under a leader named Thomas Fitzpatrick, bound for the Green River Rendezvous. Among them rode two who had heard whispers of the Crow forts, natural strongholds said to be scattered through the Bighorns, used by native guides in times of danger. Fitzpatrick, pragmatic and curious, marked them on his map with tiny crosses. "Could be myth," one of his men muttered. "Could be wisdom," Fitzpatrick replied. As they camped along the creek, a scout returned with news smoke in the hills, faint but steady. Fitzpatrick frowned. "Keep the fire low," he said. "There are forts in this country we were not meant to find." Far above, the old man in the hidden fort stirred. He felt the shift in the wind, the scent of men and iron. For a long while he listened, the way a fox listens before breaking cover. "They come again," he murmured. "The white men?" asked the boy. "Yes, but not the same ones. The first came hungry. These come for power." He rose slowly, his joints crackling. From a crevice in the stone, he drew a relic, a trap hammer, rusted and worn smooth by years of use. "This was left by the one they called Smith," he said. "He carried it from the Great Salt Lake to the plains. When he died, the hammer stayed. Now it belongs to the fort." The boy reached out reverently. "Will they find us?" Old Bear smiled. "Only if the mountain wishes it." That night the wind shifted again. Fitzpatrick's men heard distant drumming, not war drums, but the deep hollow beat of a log struck rhythmically, echoing between cliffs. Some said it was a signal. Others swore it was the mountain itself. When dawn came, the smoke was gone. The scouts found no fort, no footprints, no sign of life. Yet one man claimed that, as the sun rose, he saw a shimmer, a shadow against the rock that seemed shaped by human hands. In his journal that night, Fitzpatrick wrote, "This country holds secrets older than the trade. I have ridden 5 years among the peaks and still find trails unseen. The natives speak of fortresses that breathe, built of stone and hidden by wind. I believe them." Journal of Thomas Fitzpatrick, March 1832, U.S. National Archives. Years later, when the fur trade waned and the wagon roads cut across the plains, some of those forts were rediscovered, half collapsed, grass-grown, their entrances disguised by centuries of snow and moss. Archaeologists of the modern age would find traces: fire-blackened stone, animal bone, bits of iron hammered into crude hinges. But most were never found. Those who lived among the tribes said they still existed not in the way of walls and rooms, but as places of spirit, where the Crow or Shoshone might sit and feel the breath of their ancestors. Places where even a soldier's keenest eye would pass over and see only wilderness. In the 1,870 seconds, an old Crow elder, perhaps a grandson of Bear in the Brush, was asked by a Smithsonian collector whether such forts had truly existed. The elder smiled and said, "You look for forts of wood and stone. We built forts of wind and silence." Today, in the records of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, there are entries that trace faint outlines of those structures, triangulated from trapper maps, native oral histories, and scattered notes from Smith, Bridger, and Larpenteur. One, identified in 2016, lies near the upper Graybull River. Aerial scans show a natural shelf shaped by human modification, likely an 1,822nd shelter site. Yet the evidence remains circumstantial, as if the mountains themselves conspired to keep their secrets buried. By the summer of 1843, the age of the mountain men was waning. The beaver hats that once crowned the heads of Europe's finest had fallen from fashion, replaced by silk. The rendezvous were smaller now, the trade posts quieter, and the wild country once ruled by silence and rifle smoke was being mapped, measured, and sold. Yet in the far northern ranges, the hidden forts remained. A young surveyor named Andrew Talbot rode through the Yellowstone Plateau that summer, charged with charting a possible route for an overland mail line. His Crow guide, Elk, moved ahead of him like a ghost, pausing often to read the ground. "See there," the scout whispered, pointing toward a line of spruce that edged a shallow ravine. "That hill is hollow," Talbot laughed, "a trick of the eye." But when they crossed the ridge, he saw it a depression cut into the slope, rimmed by stone and choked with grass. The mouth of an old shelter, almost invisible beneath the years. Inside lay the remains of a fire ring, a rusted blade, and a coil of willow roots still woven into the dirt ceiling. Elk crouched low. "Our grandfathers built this, with the long knives from the east. They said the wind could not find them here." Talbot wrote carefully in his notebook. "Structure of uncertain origin. Constructed of sod and fieldstone, camouflaged within hillside, likely of mixed Crow and trapper origin, c. 1,820 seconds. Purpose unknown." It would be one of the last references to such a place in official record. By the close of the decade, the forts slipped entirely into legend, spoken of by old trappers around dying campfires, or by native elders who remembered the names of those who'd built them. Smith's Fort, the Crow Den, the Wolf House, none marked on maps, none confirmed by explorers. Yet, when snow fell on the high passes and the wind hummed through the pines, some swore they could hear the sound of a hammer, a single, patient strike, echoing from the ridges above. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was the mountain keeping its secret, for the frontier never truly ended, it simply grew quiet. The hidden forts, born of survival and trust between two worlds, became part of the land's own story buried beneath pine and stone, waiting for those who still listened to the whispers of the wild. Sources: The Journal of Jedediah S. Smith, 1,831. 1,832. 40 Years a Fur Trader on the Upper Missouri, by Charles Larpenteur. Across the Wide Missouri, by Bernard DeVoto. Crow Oral Histories, Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, Volume 7, 2019. The Missouri rolled brown and patient beneath the pale sky, carrying driftwood and silence in equal measure. On its northern bank, a steamboat groaned against its moorings. The Yellowstone Belle, a supply vessel turned survey ship for the U.S. Topographical Engineers. Her decks were cluttered with crates, barometers, tripods, and the rusted remnants of 1,000 expeditions. At a small table in the ship's cabin sat Captain Elias Granger, an aging cartographer whose eyes had grown soft with years of staring into distance. His maps were stacked high beside him, sheets of parchment marked by delicate black lines, rivers and ridges neatly named. Yet, for all the ink he had spilled across the West, there was something that eluded him still. Pinned to the wall was a survey chart of the Bighorn and Yellowstone country, a web of dotted trails marked where trappers, traders, and the army had passed. But in the center, near the headwaters of the Graybull, there was a blank, a gap of wilderness. A place that had resisted being known. That afternoon, a visitor boarded the steamer, a wiry old man with a limp, wearing a faded red hunting coat. His name was Josiah Rawhide Burke, a former trapper who'd lived among the Crow and the Blackfeet in his youth. Granger had summoned him to answer a single question. "Mr. Burke," the captain began, "I've read references, faint ones, to fortifications built in the high basins of the Rockies. Not military forts, native-built, hidden. You were in that country when the trade still flourished. Tell me, is there truth in it?" Burke grinned, showing teeth the color of river stones. "You've got an appetite for ghosts, Captain. Most of them forts you speak of ain't forts no more'n a foxhole." But they were real, sure enough. Built when the beaver was gold, and a man could vanish for a year and come out rich or not at all. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "I seen one once. Up by the Graybull Forks, winter of '29. Smith's men had been through, or what was left of 'em. The Crow had built a kind of hideaway, stone and sod, so well tucked under a ledge you could walk over it and never know. Roof so thick with grass, even the elk came to graze atop it. I spent 2 nights there with a man named LaRonde, eating dried trout and listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the wall. Granger's pen scratched furiously. "Could you mark it?" Burke laughed. "Mark it? No man can. That's the point. You go looking for it, and the mountain swallows you." For the next month, the steamboat drifted north while Granger and his team pored over every available map and journal. They studied Jedediah Smith's 1,831 notes, where he mentioned a fort of curious design built without axe or nail. They cross-referenced it with Larpenteur's trading logs, which spoke of crow shelters unseen except by those invited. Even the newer records from the American Mountain Men Association contained hints, drawings of hillside depressions mistaken for burrows, sketches labeled Fort Crow, Smith's Rest, the Grass House, yet none aligned on any grid or latitude. The forts, if they ever existed, moved like phantoms. Granger wrote in his log, "One cold evening, as fog rolled over the river, Burke joined Granger again on deck. 'You know,' the old trapper said, 'them forts weren't built for war. They were built for peace, for hiding from war, from hunger, from the world itself.' The Crow said, 'A good fort is one that even the wind forgets.'" Granger looked out at the silver water. "And yet here I am, trying to pin them down on a piece of paper." Burke smiled softly. "Maybe that's your mistake." He took a thin piece of charcoal and drew a crooked line on the map, ending it in a swirl where the Graybull met the Absaroka Range. "There," he said. "That's where I think the first one was. But don't bother looking. The mountain's got a better memory than any man." In late October, when the expedition finally disbanded at Fort Benton, Granger stored his maps in a crate labeled Unverified Geography. Among them was the chart with the blank center, the one he could never fill. Over the years that followed, those maps would pass through government hands, reprinted, redrawn, and sanitized. The hidden forts never appeared on any official record again, but the legend survived. In the 1,890 seconds, a party of Smithsonian naturalists collecting specimens in the Absaroka foothills reported stumbling upon a stone depression, artificially arranged, containing remnants of charred wood. They dismissed it as a hunter's cache. A century later, archaeologists from the Museum of the Mountain Man found similar structures indistinct, half-eroded, consistent with early 19th century habitation, but impossible to date precisely. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. In his retirement, Granger kept one map framed above his desk. It showed the Missouri River in exquisite detail, the Rockies rising like a spine across the page. But in the middle, right where the Graybull Basin should have been, he left it blank, a patch of untouched parchment. Visitors would ask, "Captain, why didn't you finish that map?" He would smile faintly and reply, "Because some places draw their own boundaries." In 1878, not long before his death, he added a single note in pencil to the empty space. "The land remembers those who learned to vanish. The summer of 1911 came dry and harsh to the Wind River Range. Pines crackled with resin under the sun, and the air shimmered with heat where glaciers had once breathed. The last of the old trappers were gone, their trails replaced by prospectors and parkmen with notebooks and cameras. Yet in the folds of the mountains, beyond the paths of mule trains and survey rods, there still lay places, untouched places, that remembered. At the edge of one such canyon, a young ethnographer named Dr. Henry Alden dismounted his horse and studied the ridge ahead. He was part of the Smithsonian's Western Ethnology Project, charged with documenting the vanishing traces of frontier life burial cairns, pictographs, trading routes, and, if rumor held true, the legendary Crow strongholds that no army had ever found. Alden's guide, a soft-spoken Crow elder named Little Owl, walked beside him, his face weathered like river stone. He carried no rifle, only a willow staff carved with spirals. "You look for the forts of the old ones," Little Owl said quietly. "But they do not wish to be found." Alden smiled, tipping his hat. Everything leaves a trace, my friend, even secrets. Little Owl stopped, pressing a hand to the earth. Some secrets are the earth. By mid-afternoon, they reached a high saddle where the air thinned and the valley opened below like a green sea. The guide motioned for Alden to dismount. He pointed to a dark cleft in the cliffside, no larger than a bear den. "There," he said. Alden crouched and peered into the shadow. The entrance sloped down gently, not a cave, but something shaped by design. Inside, his lantern revealed a narrow chamber, walled in rough stone, fitted without mortar. The ceiling was sod and willow, packed with root fibers long turned to dust. At the far end, beneath a low arch, lay the faint remains of a fire ring. Alden knelt, his pulse quickening. "It's true," he whispered. "It's all true." He brushed the ash carefully with a small brush. Beneath the soot he found fragments of iron, a buckle, a flattened nail, and something stranger, a circular seal made of hammered brass bearing faint letters. He held it to the light. S.J.S. 1827 Jedediah Smith's initials. He froze. Could it be genuine, or merely coincidence, a trader's trinket? But the placement, the date, the workmanship, all spoke of the early fur trade. Little Owl's voice came from behind him. "That mark belonged to a man your people say was killed by the Arikara, but the old ones say he walked far before he died. He built with us. He learned to hide." Alden turned, astonished. "You mean Smith himself?" The elder nodded. "He knew the song of the mountains. He built the first Ashpay Awache, the Whispering Fort. We still speak his name when the snow falls." That night, Alden sat outside the fort beneath a sky, alive with stars. His field journal lay open on his knee. He wrote. But as he wrote, he began to feel the unease that comes with trespassing into something older than oneself. The silence was immense, not empty, but watchful. The mountains seemed to breathe. The pines swayed without wind. Little Owl broke the silence. "When we built these places, it was not to hide from men. It was to hide from the hunger of the world. You can find them with your eyes, but not with your heart. That is why no army ever did." Alden closed his notebook. "You speak as if they are still alive." The elder smiled faintly. "The forts sleep, but they remember the hands that built them." For 3 more days they surveyed the ridge, uncovering fragments, a bone awl, a chipped blade, a piece of glass likely from a trader's mirror. Alden mapped everything with precision, yet he sensed that his measurements could not capture the place. The fort seemed to change with the light. In morning, it vanished into the hillside. By noon, the stones glowed pale as bone. By evening, it looked like nothing more than the shadow of a cloud. Before they left, Little Owl asked him to close the entrance again. "Why?" Alden asked. "So it can rest." Alden hesitated, then helped pile sod and rock until the chamber disappeared. When they were done, it looked as if no man had ever touched it. As they rode down the canyon, a thunderstorm broke over the peaks. Rain swept the valley, and in the gray blur behind them, the hidden fort vanished once more into the mountain skin. When Alden returned to Washington that autumn, he presented his findings to the Smithsonian's Board of Ethnology. His report, "Stone Forts of the Wind River Range, an Inquiry into Pre-Military Frontier Architecture," was published the following year. Scholars debated its authenticity. Some dismissed it as romantic conjecture. Others hailed it as the first physical evidence of the elusive Crow Mountain Man collaborations of the 1,820 seconds, but Alden himself never returned to the site. He kept Smith's brass seal locked in a small wooden box, labeled Unverified Artifact 1827. When he died in 1923, the box was found among his papers with a single note inside. "The mountains keep what we borrow." In the years since, several expeditions have sought the hidden forts. Again, archaeologists, historians, even the occasional treasure hunter. None have rediscovered Alden's site. The coordinates in his journal, though precise, lead only to a stretch of forest where the slopes shift with each landslide, and no 2 ridgelines ever look the same. But among the Crow people, the legend lives still. Hunters tell of hearing faint hammering beneath the snow or seeing smoke rise from a cliff that disappears when approached. One elder, interviewed by the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal in 2004, said simply, "Those forts were not lost, they just stopped needing to be found." Even today, rangers in the Wind River backcountry speak of finding odd stone patterns, low rings overgrown with sage, depressions that hold the snow longer than the rest. They file their reports quietly, labeling them natural anomalies. But among the few who still know the old stories, there's a different belief, that the forts still breathe when the first frost comes. Sometimes, at dawn, mist rises from the ground in thin columns that look like smoke. No campfire, no people, just memory escaping the soil. The land remembers. And the hidden forts, those silent architects of survival, remember us too.